Hello and welcome to Board of It. I'm Farrell and today I'm going to be reviewing Eclipse Seekers and Eclipse Outcasts, the two big box expansions for Eclipse Second Dawn for the Galaxy. Now, each of these expansions contains two new factions for Eclipse, with Outcasts containing the Indi Syndicate and the Exiles, while Seekers contains the Enlightened of Lyra and the Wardens of Magellen. I'm going to go through the factions and expansions one by one, just explaining what makes them different from existing factions and giving some thoughts on them. And then we'll wrap it all up at the end with a little summary. So just please note that we bought Eclipse Second Dawn for the Galaxy ourselves, but we were provided very kindly the two expansions by the publisher for review. Starting with the Exiles, they're quite a fun faction that I enjoyed playing as. They essentially have the gimmick that they begin the game with the orbital technology and an orbital. And this means that since they can build these from the start, they will get to kickstart their economy that bit more and have a bit more flexibility when it comes to money and science and getting those cubes out. They'll also score 1 point per orbital they control at the end of the game. So they're all about getting them out and keeping them. And what's interesting is actually their orbitals are essentially their star bases. They don't have star bases, they just have orbitals which they can upgrade and which can defend themselves. So that creates quite an interesting element of gameplay to combat, because they can obviously aim to and will want to litter their orbitals across all their territories. And that means that anyone invading them kind of has to go step by step and fight off these orbitals / star bases. So I think they're going to be more fun to play in a lower play count game, just because they're based upon, getting territory and getting these orbitals out, and that gets some points. Whereas in a higher player count game, you obviously have more of a fight for space. And I think also the fact that their orbitals don't disappear, so other players can control them if they take that territory, makes them quite a prime target for being attacked, especially if they have done well at spreading out those orbitals. Unlike the Exiles, the Indi Syndicate, the other faction in the Outcast expansion, are much better for higher player counts. They're combat driven, and they're incentivized to keep fighting. This is because they get money relative to how many reputation tiles they draw after a combat. So they want to keep fighting and keep drawing those tiles. This excess money means that they're able to take a lot of actions you wouldn't expect them to, and they have a really good trade ratio of money to science and/or materials. This means that they can also generate resources quite flexibly. They're also quite frightful in combat, because all of their ships have increased initiatives. They come pre-built with Gauss shields, which reduce other players' roll, and they can move a whopping 4 times per move action. However, this is all balanced out by the fact that they can't build dreadnoughts. Their ships cost more per ship to build, and they have only 2 colony ships, meaning it's hard to expand and get their economy going as they conquer terrain. Generally, they're going to be best in a higher player count game, because you'll have more options for conflict and combat. Also, because they have another mechanism, which is where when they betray someone they have an alliance with, usually you get the traitor tile, and that can give you points if you have it at the end of the game. They don't lose points from that. And this mechanism is only present in 4-player or higher games, meaning that you're missing out something they can do if you're playing with 3 or 2 players. So definitely one to play when you have a big group together. And I think they're best given to someone who knows Eclipse, just because they have pros and they have cons. And you want someone who understands the game, who can balance those out and play effectively. Turning to the Seekers expansion, the first faction, the Wardens of Magellen, are unfortunately our least favorite faction, probably out of all of Eclipse Second Dawn. They have a really interesting starting point, which is working with discovery tiles and playing around with those. But unfortunately, there's so much randomness involved that they can end up being just like playing the Terrans, because you don't really get to interact with that element at all. Essentially, they get victory points for having discovery tiles, which were ship parts, in their ships, or having at least at some point used them in their ships. But in practice, this means that they have to be lucky enough to get discovery tiles, and they have to be lucky enough that then those discovery tiles are ship parts. They do have one kind of little opportunity where they get given a discovery tile face down at the beginning of the game. And if they get 4 technologies of one type, they can then take that. But as a faction bonus, that's kind of whatever. And it's also railroading you into sticking to one technology, which is fine because you get points. But it should really, I think if you're an inexperienced player, it can then make you make bad decisions as an incentive just to get that discovery tile and play around with your faction. Now, their one saving grace is their other faction ability, their colony ships. Here, you can flip a colony ship to get a resource of your choice. And it sounds really small, but it has a really interesting effect on gameplay, because Eclipse is a game of tight resources. And having the ability just to get that one material you need to build a dreadnought, or that one science you need to get that technology this round rather than the next, can have a massive impact on the game. And it creates quite an interesting conundrum of, should I use this now to get what I need in the moment, or should I not use it so I can put a cube out and get more resources and have more to work with next turn? And I found that really interesting and a really kind of novel little element of playing around. Unfortunately, coming back to the negatives, I do think, or we both think, that the Wardens of Magellen have also the worst ships in Eclipse. They're all very samey looking, no matter the class. And on top of that, we've ended up nicknaming them as the penis ships, because they all have these really phallic protrusions. And they're just kind of, I don't know, there's something a little bit gross about them in general. So that's another element we didn't like. The Enlightened of Lyra, the second faction in the Seekers expansion, is probably the most interesting faction out of both the expansions, just because they have the most going on. You can call them the Shrine faction, because they have a sideboard filled with shrines, and these shrines are divided into rows, and each row is associated with a reward. When you build all the shrines from one row, you get that reward, and the better the reward, the more expensive the shrines are to build. And every time you build a shrine, you have to build. So it's quite interesting, because also the shrines are worth 1 VP, but they make you spend resources you would usually spend on other things like ships and research. You kind of have to hoard, right? So it's this really interesting trade-off where if you get them out, you're getting points and eventually, hopefully, getting rewards. But can you afford it? Does that impact you in other areas? So that's quite fun. And I think also the fact that the most expensive row of shrines, the reward there is an extra influence disc, which means that you could have 4 influence discs extra if you play your cards right, which is, I mean, huge, right, in terms of the actions you can take. They also have special colony ships where you can flip a colony ship to reroll 1 die in combat. That's a really interesting mechanism, and it completely changes how combat with them works in terms of how you go about it and what you think. Because if you're not sure you can take them out quickly, they can just keep flipping ships until they can take you out. And perhaps that gives you another element to consider in combat. So all in all, really interesting faction with a lot of considerations and good fun to play as. Final thoughts. Eclipse is one of my all-time favorite games, and it's always great to have more content for it. But this and these expansions is something that's really difficult to recommend because of the pricing involved. Now, let's say up front that the reason these expansions are so expensive is because each ship class is a custom mold, and plastic molds for these kind of ships costs a lot of money. And that's the core of it, right? So you're paying for the uniqueness of the factions in terms of, the miniatures that you get. The factions in Eclipse are not that asymmetric. Of course, they all have their little twist, but you're all playing the same game, just with maybe a different starting bonus, you could argue. And as such, is there really a need for anyone to have more factions? Is of course nice, but I don't think it's a need. It's not like Brute where you end up having a completely unique experience if you have a new faction. However, I will say that I really enjoy these factions. I think there are some really interesting ones. And if I had to recommend one, it would be one expansion, it would be Outcasts for sure. I think both of the factions are of an equal level of interest and enjoyability in playing them. Whereas obviously with Seekers, the problem is I think you have the worst and the best expansion faction, arguably, in one box. I just, really don't find the Wardens of Magellen interesting or think they provide that much. I think another element that it's not really something that I've had much problem with, but I think there's also been complaints that these expansions have a little bit of lower quality than the base game. The cubes are a bit smaller, particularly noticeable in Row Indi faction. And the fact that the ships are on the whole a little bit smaller than their counterparts in the base game. Just some kind of common complaints there to be aware of. So that was our review of the two expansions, Seekers and Outcasts. Really enjoyed getting to play more Eclipse, and please ask any questions you have about these factions. So that was our review, and I really appreciate you watching. Please subscribe if it was helpful, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.